I have zero optimism in terms of any sort of peace agreement being achieved. There will not be any sort of bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin to discuss or have any sort of dialogue about a future peace agreement. Nor will there be any sort of trilateral meeting. So I would rule all of that out.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, August 22nd, 2025.
There's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's
the Putin-Trump Alaska Summit, held on August 15th, ended without significant progress as negotiations broke down over Russia's uncompromising demands. In the days that followed, the White House hosted President Zelensky and European leaders to reaffirm Western unity amid the Ukraine war. Canada also convened a virtual Coalition of the Willing meeting focused on coordinating efforts to support Ukraine and repurpose frozen Russian assets. Here today to discuss the significance and impact of the Alaska Summit and the White House Summit, as well as how these events have impacted ceasefire talks over Ukraine, we're joined once again by Marcus Kolga. This is the Expert Series. Marcus, thanks for joining the CDA Institute's podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on, Josh.
So we have a couple things to get through today. The Putin-Trump Alaska Summit from last week, the follow-up meeting with Zelensky at the White House and some of the EU leaders, and then, of course, Canada's virtual coalition of the Willing meeting and what Canada can do to continue supporting Ukraine. So I guess it might be pertinent to start off with the Putin-Trump Alaska Summit, Marcus. Wondering maybe you can contextualize the summit for us and then maybe provide us with some of your key observations or takeaways.
Yeah, sure. I think everyone who's been keeping an eye on Putin, on what the Kremlin's been doing over the past decade or so, I think everyone's expectations were quite low for the summit in terms of any sort of positive outcome. I have to admit that I was a little bit optimistic going into it. So the week before the summit, Trump's envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff, was in Moscow for talks with Kremlin officials, with Vladimir Putin himself. And the communique that came out from both sides, the Kremlin and the White House sides, after that meeting, basically said that no progress had been made, that the two sides had exchanged signals, but there was no big statement. There was no real reason for any sort of optimism for a meeting or even a summit really coming out of that. But what was really interesting, and I think it was underreported at the time, was that about half an hour after Witkoff's meeting with Putin ended, the White House announced, and I think it was Donald Trump probably on his Truth Social account, announced that he would be imposing secondary tariffs, or I would call them secondary sanctions, on India. So 25% tariffs on India. And that was due to their ongoing purchases and huge imports of Russian oil and gas. And so we know that India, along with Turkey and China and a few other countries, but the three of them primarily, they are the largest ongoing importers of Russian oil at this point. And that's really crucial. Those revenues that Russia generates from the sales of oil and gas to those countries are really what is continuing to help drive this war, to fund this war, the manufacturing of these drones and missiles and such that are being fired at an alarming rate of several hundred every night against Ukrainian civilian targets, and that are largely responsible for the dozens of people that are being wounded or killed in these strikes every single night. And so, when that announcement happened, I think I, along with many others, we were quite optimistic that Donald Trump had seen the light in terms of who he is dealing with in Russia with Vladimir Putin, that he was starting to recognize that the U.S. could be really impacting and influencing Russian behavior through these sorts of levers like sanctions and secondary sanctions. And there was an immediate result to all of this. So within 24 hours of Donald Trump imposing those secondary sanctions, India announced that it would be placing an indefinite moratorium, a pause on all purchases of Russian oil from that point on. And I strongly believe, again, having watched the Kremlin now for 20, 25 years, I suspect that this sent the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, those that support him, into a bit of a panic, because we know that they are burning through Russian reserves at an alarming rate. The Russian economy itself is overheated and teetering right now, and so this threat to potential these revenues would have been quite alarming for the Kremlin. And if you look at the timeline, it's just after that there was this talk about a summit the following week on last Friday, that something was being planned, and I suspect that Donald Trump's secondary tariffs against India helped motivate the Kremlin to come around the table. Now, it's really unfortunate that it appears that while it appears that Donald Trump became rather aware of the levers that the U.S. had in pressuring Russia to end this war, or at least to agree to a ceasefire, all of those were sort of dashed, I think, over a few hours in Alaska, and certainly in the hours that followed. And personally, I don't have any sort of hope that we will achieve a peace at this point. Maybe a ceasefire. I think that's the best case scenario at this point. But all of that, I was a little bit optimistic going into Alaska, but it turned out that nothing was really achieved.
I'm hoping you can play psychologist for us for a couple of minutes, Marcus. What does someone like Vladimir Putin, what do you think he aims to get out of this summit? Like I've seen some people speculate that perhaps Putin's buying time, trying to avoid sanctions. I've also heard that he had very, again, maximalist ambitions and demands going into the meeting. Can we unpack Putin, his mindset, and what this meeting did for him?
Yeah. So, I mean, Vladimir Putin, I think, believes that he has the upper hand right now in this war. Vladimir Putin and his officials have repeatedly stated that the only acceptable outcome for Russia in this war is the seizure of all those territories, the achieving of all of its objectives, which is complete control over Donbass, in the south, Kherson and Zaporizhia, and of course international recognition that Crimea is part of Russia. And so there is no reason to believe, if we understand who Vladimir Putin is, the Kremlin, I mean, and even going back to Soviet times, I mean, the Kremlin, the Russia's rulers do not give into any sort of concessions. And so I don't think there was any reason to believe that they would, without any sort of significant pressure, and that pressure has not appeared, that they would give up anything. And so we also know that Vladimir Putin has made this war, whether it's in terms of, Russia's economy, and certainly Russia's domestic propaganda, it is central to helping maintain Vladimir Putin remain in power. This war itself, even going back to 2014, these were wars that were created as distractions for the Russian people. Vladimir Putin has been in power for now 25 years. And so, and we know that he has not delivered on any of the promises that he made to the Russian people, certainly not those Russians who are living in the regions. They live in essentially in squalor. It's outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other larger Russian cities. Russia is very much a third world country. There was a recent report by Russia's auditor, I think it was in 2019 or 2020, that a quarter of Russia's hospitals don't even have running water. And so these are the conditions that Russians are living in right now. And so this, what Vladimir Putin has done over the past 25 years is he's created this image of a strongman, that he is the protector of Russia. And so the war against Ukraine, which also exploits all sorts of Russian historical propaganda and such about, defending Russia against Nazis, all of that has been regurgitated to create these bogeymen, this threat that Vladimir Putin is the only Russian leader that can protect Russians from. And so all of this is extremely central to Vladimir Putin and his legitimacy. And of course, in terms of the economy, I mean, Russia's economy has been completely geared up and shifted towards supporting the war. So Vladimir Putin has, at this point, there's nothing to motivate him to stop this war. He places zero value on human life. So the meat grinder, as I think a lot of listeners will have heard Russia's operations in Ukraine referred to, the fact that Russia has essentially, I think they just surpassed a million casualties on the battlefield. This means nothing to Vladimir Putin. So when your entire power, everything, the legitimacy of your presidency relies on basically on this war. Your economy is focused on this war. You've placed no value on human life. There's no reason to believe that Vladimir Putin has any interest in ending this war. And so I think these efforts, the summit, as make perhaps Donald Trump believe that he could achieve some sort of peace, despite all these good intentions, they're futile unless we place significant pressure on Vladimir Putin to come to the table and seriously talk about a ceasefire or a peace.
Marcus, how would you characterize the current U.S. position or stance on when it comes to supporting Ukraine? To someone who maybe is not an international relations scholar or a very astute follower of international relations, geopolitics, the U.S. administration's actions and behavior might be construed as at least somewhat confusing. At times we do know that Trump and his administration have been accused of parroting basically Kremlin talking points. We had that infamous meeting between Zelenskyy and Trump in the beginning of the year. A possible retrenchment from NATO, yet we also saw what some perceived to be a relatively positive NATO summit. Trump seemed to walk away happy. Everyone agreed to commit to 5%. And then, of course, in the White House meeting this past week, it seemed like things were a bit warmer between Zelenskyy and Trump. So I'm wondering if you might be able to discuss what you think that the overall U.S. policy on this is.
Well, I mean, you said it yourself. I mean, it's confusing. It's hard to really track from one day to the next, one minute to the next. Certainly over the past week and a half, it's been very, very difficult to predict where, what Donald Trump's objectives really are. I think it's a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, you mentioned the fact that, Donald Trump has at times parroted Kremlin talking points, certainly about who's responsible for starting this war. We recall back in February, March, I mean, he repeatedly stated that it was Ukraine really that was responsible for the war. I think that it appeared that he was coming to a realization about the realities of what is happening. A few weeks ago, I just talked about the secondary sanctions that were imposed on India. And so I think some of us were optimistic that maybe that Donald Trump was taking a bit of a tougher stance on Russia. But then, we saw what happened in Anchorage. Vladimir Putin is a crafty former Russian KGB colonel. He knows how to, and he's being trained in how to manipulate his adversaries, and I think he was quite successful at this in Anchorage. We got the evidence of this directly from Donald Trump, who basically said that during the meeting, Vladimir Putin had confirmed to Donald Trump that the 2020 election had been robbed from Donald Trump, that mail-in ballots were the primary cause of this, and that no other nation uses mail-in ballots and such. And I think that Vladimir Putin used this sort of psychology and this trying to make it appear as though he understood or could empathize with Donald Trump's grievances to warm up to him. And so where we had Donald Trump taking a tougher stance going into Anchorage, he came out of it basically again acting as a proxy for voicing Vladimir Putin's maximalist demands on Donbass and Crimea. He even appeared on Fox News essentially. I believe it was the next morning after the White House summit, and was again repeating Kremlin talking points about Ukraine starting the war. So, again, tracking which direction the White House would be going in on any of these issues is pretty challenging. But I will say that it does appear, and you mentioned the NATO summit and the positive outcome there. I think that our allies, certainly our European allies, have also sort of tuned into how they might be able to get Donald Trump to respond positively to their issues, and are very much playing that same game. So it'll be interesting to see whose charm offensives are most effective over the coming weeks in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. But I think that in terms of that sort of a game, I think that Russia is far more experienced, and certainly Vladimir Putin is as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Before we move on to briefly discuss the White House meeting, I'm wondering if you might be able to provide maybe just a really quick summary of your thoughts on the implications of this summit, and maybe where you see relations and negotiations going forward in the next weeks to months or so, as in terms of how much we can predict that at all.
Well, look, I have zero optimism in terms of any sort of peace agreement being achieved. There will not be any sort of bilateral meeting between President Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin to discuss or have any sort of dialogue about a future peace agreement, nor will there be any sort of trilateral meeting. So I would rule all of that out. And I have, like I said, I have zero optimism for any sort of long-term peace agreement at this point. I think the positive takeaway from the White House summit was that Europe is clearly united, and it is united in support of Ukraine. So I think this is a very positive takeaway. The security guarantees that have been talked about, the fact that Europe clearly seems to be on board with trying to provide some of those security guarantees, even if it's limited to purchasing U.S. weapons and delivering them to Ukraine. I think that's a positive. I don't have any hope that European boots will be on the ground anytime soon in Ukraine. That would require at least a ceasefire, which I think is also we're a ways away from that. And clearly, the signs coming or the signals coming out of the Kremlin with Foreign Minister Lavrov basically saying that there will be, that no security guarantees can be discussed without the Kremlin at the table. That's a clear indicator that the Kremlin will be opposed to any sort of security guarantees and any sort of European boots on the ground. So I'm not too optimistic about that. But like I said, I think the one positive thing coming out of this is this demonstration of European unity, and I would include Canada in on that as well, even though Canada wasn't at the talks, but European unity was quite positive.
So, in regards to the talks, Marcus, I'm wondering if there was a White House meeting that followed the Alaska Summit shortly thereafter. We had Zelenskyy, some key European leaders, Donald Trump at the White House. What was the impetus for this meeting? Maybe what are some of the key or major takeaways that our audience should know? And, how did relations seem between President Zelenskyy and Trump?
Well, look, I think that what drove this meeting was the realization that, there couldn't possibly be any sort of agreement between Russia and Ukraine without having Ukraine around the table. And I would also argue having, European input on any of this. And so, I think that the adults in the White House recognize this, and this is one of the reasons why this meeting was called. And again, the fact that these major European leaders, the president of France, Germany's chancellor, these are all significant individuals, that they basically canceled any plans that they had, and at the drop of a hat joined President Zelenskyy at this meeting in Washington, was a very, very strong signal. It sent a strong signal to Vladimir Putin that Ukraine's allies are clearly supporting Ukraine and backing it in terms of any sort of future ceasefire or peace deal is concerned. And it also sent a strong message, I think, to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump clearly, I think he respects Vladimir Putin. That's very clear. Perhaps even admires him, but I think he also has respect for a number of those European leaders that were at the White House. And quite remarkably, the Finnish President Alexander Stubb among them. And so having them all together backing Ukraine was a very important signal. What came out of it? I mean, we had some flip-flopping from the White House. Initially, it said that the White House has signaled that it would be part of the security guarantees for Ukraine. It then, I think a day later, the White House came out and said it would play a coordinating role. We don't really know what that means. But the sales of U.S. weapons to the European countries and onward to Ukraine, that was not off the table. So I think that was a positive outcome in all of this as well. A bit concerning was, Donald Trump's understanding of what security guarantees might look like. There was a statement that he had, I guess, spoken to the Kremlin, and that the Kremlin was open to passing legislation that would prevent Russia from invading Ukraine again or any other European territory. You can't take anything like that seriously. Russia is an authoritarian country. Vladimir Putin has demonstrated over and over again over the past 25 years his complete disregard for any sort of treaties that Russia has. I mean, there were security guarantees that were supposed to be in place for Ukraine back in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, of course, gave up its nuclear weapons in return for a promise from Russia to never invade Ukraine, and that was a treaty that Russia signed its name to, and of course, Russia has not respected that either. So, any sort of promises by the Kremlin, either now or down the road, about curbing its aggression towards Ukraine in the future should be immediately dismissed. And quite frankly, what we should be doing is making sure, regardless of, even if there is a peace agreement signed to, or the peace agreement that is signed, which I don't think is likely, what the Western allies, including Canada, need to do is to continue supporting Ukraine, making sure that it has the weapons it needs, because we have to simply assume that Russia will try this again. It could try it the same attack Ukraine again in the future, or it may try this somewhere else in Europe, whether it's Poland, the Baltic states, Finland. And those countries are preparing for that. And so we need to support them and have that same understanding of who we're dealing with in terms of Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Well, thank you, Marcus. I have just one more quick question before we wrap up. Canada was absent from the meeting in the White House. However, we did participate in a coalition of the willing meeting virtually thereafter. Is there any significance to this or no? And, you touched on this briefly, but what can Canada keep doing, especially within the context of this shifting international security environment we find ourselves in? What can Canada keep doing to support Ukraine effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read much into the fact that Canada wasn't invited to the White House. We're in a pretty significant trade dispute with the U.S. right now, and clearly there are issues, personal issues between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Carney. So I'm not surprised that Canada wasn't invited there. I mean, Canadians should recognize and should be proud of the fact that Canada has been a significant contributor to Ukraine's defense. We're also a significant contributor to peace elsewhere in Europe. That means our leadership of the Enhanced Forward Presence mission the NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence mission in Latvia. And so, I think that we are very much respected by our European allies. And as you mentioned, we were included on the call of the Coalition of the Willing, and we're an important part of that coalition now, and certainly moving forward. What can Canada do, to apply that pressure that's so needed on supporting Ukraine, but also pressuring Vladimir Putin to come around the table and negotiate some sort of a ceasefire. It's the continued supply of weapons to Ukraine. So working with our allies to purchase those U.S. weapons and supply them to Ukraine. That's going to be of key importance. Canada needs to continue its leadership in terms of sanctions. Canada was critical to getting the European Union to agree to repurposing some of the 300 billion Canadian dollars in Russian assets that are frozen in European banks. So the proceeds from that are being repurposed to support Ukraine. We were a key leader in getting the European Union to agree to that. What we now need to do is make sure that the entire amount, the 3 billion Canadian dollars, or I think it's around 190 billion euros or so, getting that repurposed and getting that money to the Ukrainians so that they can use it to continue purchasing high quality weapons to defend its current territory and to push back the Russians. And also on secondary sanctions, we saw just the other week, as I mentioned earlier, secondary sanctions on countries like India, who continue to access Russian oil and gas, using Russia essentially as their personal sort of gas station. Applying secondary sanctions on them does change their behavior. India placed that moratorium on the purchase of Russian oil and gas. So we should be following that lead because it clearly works. Canada should be placing secondary sanctions on Turkish entities, on Chinese entities, on Indian entities that are both purchasing oil and gas from Russia, but also supplying Russia with the components that it needs to continue building its drones and its missiles. And we should be encouraging our allies to do the same, because it's only through that sort of maximum pressure, especially the economic pressure, that we're going to get Vladimir Putin to bend at all. The only thing that the only language he understands is strength, and we need to demonstrate that.
Marcus, thanks for coming on the program and unpacking with us the events of this past week, which are very significant. I know the CDAI community always enjoys your perspectives and always enjoys listening to you. And that's all for today's episode. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.